My name does not matter much in this story. What matters is a small dragon named Vess, her mother Ashkari, and a night when the sky fell apart above a research station called Thren. I came to Thren Station 3 weeks before that night. I was not a scientist. I was not a doctor. I was a simple human liaison, sent by the Confederacy to help humans and the Veilithi understand each other better. The Veilithi are a proud species. They look like great dragons from old Earth stories, with long necks, wide wings, and scales that change color with their feelings. Some are blue when calm. Some turn deep red when angry. I had only been on the station a short time, and I still did not know most of their moods. I was still learning their language, their customs, and their history. The Veilithi did not fully trust humans yet. We were new to their world, and trust takes time to build between two very different peoples. I understood that. I did not push. I simply did my work, greeted them with respect, and tried to learn. Then came the storm. It was not an ordinary storm. A field of small space rocks, what the station called a meteor shower, moved closer to Thren than anyone expected. The station's outer shields were old, and during the worst part of the storm, half of them failed. Alarms rang through every hallway. Lights flickered. The whole station shook like a small boat on a rough sea. I was walking near the nursery dome when the doors sealed shut for safety. I could not leave. I could not call for help right away because the storm was blocking most communication signals, so I stayed where I was, alone in a large round room filled with soft green light, thick plants, and one very frightened mother dragon. Her name was Ashkari. I had seen her before from a distance, always calm, always proud, walking slowly through the station gardens, but that night she was not calm. She was in pain. Her body was shaking, and I understood right away that something important was happening. She was giving birth, and it was happening too soon, and the storm outside was making everything worse. I did not know what to do. I was not a doctor. I did not know Veilithi biology. All I could do was stay close and try to help in the only way I knew how. When I was a child, my grandmother used to sit with me during storms back on Earth. She would hold my hand and hum a soft tune, one with no real name, just a simple melody she had learned from her own mother. It always made me feel safe. Without thinking much about it, I found myself humming that same tune to Ashkari. I do not know why. It was simply the thing my body remembered to do when someone was scared. I kept my voice low and steady. I stayed close enough for her to see me, but not so close that I would be in her way. The ceiling groaned above us. Small pieces of debris hit the outer shields with loud bangs. But through all of that noise, I kept humming, over and over, the same simple tune. And then, in the middle of all that chaos, the egg cracked open. A small, wet, very loud dragon appeared, crying out with a sound far too big for her tiny body. Ashkari gently curled around her daughter, exhausted but relieved. The storm slowly passed. The alarms stopped. The lights returned to normal. By the time the doors opened again, the danger was over, and a new life had begun. Ashkari named her daughter Vess. I stepped back and let the station's medical team take over. I answered a few questions about what had happened, then returned to my quarters to rest. I thought that night was simply a strange and lucky memory, nothing more. I did not expect it to shape the following months of my life. 3 days later, my communicator woke me very early in the morning. It was the station's lead veterinarian, and her voice sounded worried. Vess would not eat. She had refused several feedings in a row. She stayed curled in a tight ball, shaking, and nothing the medical team tried could calm her. Worse, Ashkari had grown distressed watching her daughter suffer, and a distressed mother dragon was not something the station wanted to deal with. I hurried to the nursery dome, still half asleep, unsure why they needed me. When I arrived, I found Ashkari pacing near the edge of the nest, her wings raised, her eyes sharp and alert. She looked at me the moment I entered, and for a moment I felt like I had walked into the wrong room. Her gaze was heavy with suspicion, as if she could not decide whether I was part of the problem or part of the solution. The veterinarian handed me a small bowl of prepared food. "Please, just try," she said. "We have tried everything else." I did not understand what she expected me to do differently. I knelt slowly at the edge of the nest, keeping my movements calm and unhurried. Vess was curled tightly, shivering despite the warm air of the dome. I did not reach for her right away. I simply sat there, the same way I had sat there 3 nights before. And then, without really deciding to, I began humming that same old tune. Vess's head lifted almost instantly. Her 2 large eyes locked onto me, and before anyone could react, she scrambled across the nest, clumsy and eager, and pushed her face straight into my hands. Then she ate. She ate everything in the bowl, quickly, as if she had been hungry for a very long time. The room went silent. Even Ash Carey seemed frozen for a moment, watching her daughter eat calmly for the first time in days. Then she made a soft sound, one I had never heard a Vailithi make before. It was not a warning. It was not anger. It was something gentler, something almost like relief. From that day forward, I became part of Vess's daily routine. I fed her every meal. I hummed the same tune each time, and each time she calmed the moment she heard it. The station staff found this strange but useful, and soon it became clear that no one else could replace me during feedings. If I was away, even briefly, Vess refused to eat until I returned. At first, I worried this meant something was wrong with her, that perhaps she had grown too attached to me in an unhealthy way. I asked the veterinarian about it, and she admitted she did not fully understand it either. The Vailithi were still a species we did not know everything about. Their biology, their instincts, and their early development were still mostly a mystery to human scientists. Weeks passed. I fed Vess morning and evening. Sometimes I stayed longer than necessary, sitting quietly near the nest while she slept, simply because it felt right to be there. Ash Carey, who had once watched me with suspicion, began to relax. She no longer paced anxiously when I entered the room. She no longer raised her wings in warning. Instead, she would lower her head slightly. A small gesture I later learned was one of quiet respect among her kind. One afternoon, after I finished feeding Vess, Ash Carey spoke to me directly for the first time. She wore a translation collar given to her weeks earlier by the station, though she had rarely used it until now. "You sang the storm song," she said. It was not a question. I told her it was not really a song, just an old habit from my childhood, something my grandmother used to hum during storms. Ash Carey was quiet for a long moment, her wings shifting slightly. "Vailithi hatched a sound," she explained. "Before the shell breaks, before the eyes open, we hear. Inside the egg, during storms, a mother's heartbeat changes. It grows fast, then slow, then fast again. This is how a hatchling learns her first lesson before she is even born. A storm is frightening, but a storm survived means safety has returned." I listened carefully, beginning to understand where this was leading. That night, Ash Carey continued, my heart did not slow. The meteors did not stop. I could not calm myself enough to give Vess the rhythm she needed to hear before she broke free of her shell. She came into this world with no safe sound to answer her fear, except yours. I sat with those words for a long moment, feeling the weight of them settle over me. My simple, tuneless humming, a habit passed down from my grandmother, had somehow become the only steady heartbeat Vess heard during the most frightening moment of her very short life. Not her mother's heartbeat, mine, arriving by pure chance at exactly the right time. "She does not refuse food because she distrusts me," Ash Carey said. "She refuses because her body still listens for the sound that once told her the danger had passed. I did not understand this until I watched you feed her many times. I am not used to owing a debt to something so small and soft-skinned." I smiled, trying to lighten the moment. "I am not that small," I said. Ash Carey made that same soft sound again, the one that was not a warning. I would later learn it was something close to laughter among her kind. From that day, my place at the station changed. I was no longer simply a liaison learning about a new culture. I had become, without ever planning it, an important part of a young dragon's life. The station leaders noticed this too, and it was not long before it caused a new kind of problem. A group of visiting scientists arrived at Thren Station about 2 months after Vess was born. They came from a research council interested in studying Vailithi development, and they were very curious about the unusual bond between Vess and me. Some of them found it fascinating, others found it troubling. One scientist, a serious man named Dr. Wren, believed the bond was unnatural and possibly harmful. He argued that a hatchling should bond with her own mother, not with a human who happened to be present during a stressful event. He suggested that Vess be separated from me for a period of time, to see if she could learn to eat normally without my presence. I understood his concern, even if I did not agree with it. Science requires careful thinking, and I respected that he wanted to understand what was happening rather than simply accept it. Still, the idea of being separated from Vess, even briefly, made me uneasy. I had grown fond of her in a way I had not expected. Ash Carey did not react well to the suggestion. When she heard about the plan, her calm expression disappeared, replaced by something firmer, something protective. She spoke with the station leaders directly, her voice steady but strong. "My daughter's first safe sound came from this human," she said. "You may study her. You may study me, but you will not take away the comfort my daughter needs simply because you do not yet understand it." The station leaders listened carefully. They respected Ashkari greatly, both as a mother and as one of the most senior Vailithi at the station. After much discussion, they agreed to a compromise. Instead of full separation, the scientists would observe Vess's feedings while I remained present, studying her behavior without removing the source of her comfort. Dr. Wren was not fully satisfied, but he accepted the plan. Over the following days, he and his team observed quietly from the edge of the nursery dome, taking notes as I fed Vess and hummed the familiar tune. Slowly, his serious expression softened. He began asking me questions, not with suspicion, but with real curiosity. "Do you always hum the same tune?" he asked one morning. "Always the same one," I answered. "It's the only one I know by heart." He nodded slowly, writing something down. "It seems her body responds specifically to certain patterns in the sound. Not the tune itself, perhaps, but its rhythm. Slow, steady, calm." Over time, the scientists came to a new understanding. They believed that Vess had formed what they called an early sound imprint, a natural response tied to comfort and survival, rather than an unhealthy attachment. It was rare, they said, but not dangerous. In fact, several scientists began to see it as a remarkable example of how flexible and adaptive young Vailithi could be, even under human care. Dr. Wren eventually admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that he had been wrong to assume the bond was harmful. Before he left the station, he came to find me one last time. "I still believe we should study this further," he said, "but I no longer believe it should be stopped. What you gave her that night, whether by chance or by instinct, cannot simply be replaced. I respect that now." I thanked him for his honesty, and we parted on good terms. As the months passed, Vess grew quickly, as young Vailithi often do. She was no longer the small, fragile hatchling who once shook uncontrollably in her nest. Her scales grew stronger, her wings grew larger, and her personality became more playful with each passing week. She still pushed her face into my hands during feedings, though it became more of a happy habit than a true need. I still hummed the same tune, not because she required it anymore, but because it had become something we shared, something special between us. Ashkari watched all of this with quiet pride. The suspicion she once held toward me had long disappeared, replaced by something warmer, something close to friendship. She often joined us during feedings, resting nearby, her presence calm and steady. Sometimes she would speak with me about her people's history, their customs, and their beliefs. I found myself learning more from her in casual conversation than I had learned from any official training material given to me before my arrival. One evening, as the station's artificial sky shifted into a soft orange sunset color, Ashkari asked me a question that surprised me. "Do humans have a word for what we have become?" she asked. "You are not truly Vess's parent. You are not simply a caretaker either. What are you to her?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "Maybe there isn't one perfect word," I said. "Maybe it's simply family, even if it doesn't look the way family usually looks." Ashkari considered this for a long moment, then lowered her head slightly, a gesture of agreement. "Family," she repeated softly. "Yes, I believe that is close enough." As Vess grew older, she began to explore beyond the nursery dome, testing her wings in short, clumsy flights across the station's open training yard. I often watched from the sidelines, cheering quietly as she stumbled, fell, and tried again. Ashkari watched too, though she rarely interfered, allowing her daughter the freedom to learn through her own mistakes. One day, during one of these practice flights, Vess flew farther than she ever had before, gliding across the yard with surprising grace. She circled once, then landed clumsily beside me, nearly knocking me over with her excitement. She nuzzled against my shoulder and I laughed, patting her scales gently. "You're getting better," I told her, though I doubted she understood the words themselves. Still, she seemed to understand the feeling behind them. As Vess approached her first full year of life, a milestone the Vailithi called the naming season, the station planned a small gathering to celebrate. It was not just for Vess, but for all the young Vailithi born that year. Families gathered, along with station staff who had grown close to the young dragons during their early months. I was invited to attend, and I stood beside Ashkari as the ceremony began. Vess, now much larger than the tiny hatchling I first met, stood proudly between us, her scales shining faintly under the station lights. When it came time for her formal introduction to the gathered crowd, Ashkari spoke words I had heard her practice quietly the night before. "This is my daughter, Vess," she announced, "born during the Great Storm, comforted by a human's steady voice, raised by both dragon and human hands. She carries the strength of our people and the kindness of a friend who did not have to stay, but chose to." I felt a lump form in my throat as she spoke, I had not expected to be mentioned so directly, and certainly not with such warmth. Several Veilithi around us made soft sounds of approval, and even a few station staff members wiped their eyes. After the ceremony, Vess approached me, nudging her head gently against my chest, the same way she often did after feedings. I wrapped my arms around her neck, feeling her steady breathing beneath my hands. "Happy naming day," I whispered. She made a small sound, somewhere between a growl and a hum, almost as if she were trying to imitate the tune I had hummed to her so many times before. It was not perfect, but it did not need to be. Not long after the naming ceremony, something happened that tested everything we had built together. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where nothing seems likely to go wrong. Vess, now old enough to explore parts of the station on her own, had wandered farther than usual during one of her practice flights. At first, no one worried. She often flew short distances alone, always returning within the hour. But that afternoon, the hour passed, and then another, and she did not come back. Ashcary noticed first. I found her standing at the edge of the training yard, her head raised toward the sky, her wings tense at her sides. She did not need to say anything. I could see the worry in the way her scales had shifted to a duller shade of blue. We searched together, along with several station staff members. The station's outer sections were large, filled with narrow maintenance corridors, old storage rooms, and wide-open cargo bays that had not been used in years. It would be easy for a young, curious dragon to get lost among them, especially one still learning the shape of her own wings. We called her name through the corridors. We checked every open space we could think of. As the hours passed, the worry in the group grew heavier. Ashcary said very little, but I could tell she was holding back fear the way any parent might, trying to stay calm so others would not panic as well. I thought back to the night Vess was born, to the storm, to the fear in Ashcary's eyes before I began humming that simple tune. I wondered, quietly, if sound might help us now the way it had helped us then. It was not a scientific idea. It was simply a feeling, a small hope worth trying. I asked the search team to pause for a moment near one of the larger cargo bays, an area with high ceilings and many hidden corners. Then I began to hum, the same old tune, letting my voice carry as far as it could into the wide, quiet space. At first, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft hum of the station's machines. Ashcary stood beside me, listening as closely as I was. I hummed again, louder this time, keeping the rhythm slow and steady, just as I always had during feedings. Then, from somewhere above us, near a maintenance platform close to the ceiling, we heard a small, familiar sound. It was clumsy and uncertain, but unmistakably an attempt to hum along, the same imperfect imitation Vess had made after her naming ceremony. We found her curled behind a stack of old supply crates, one wing slightly bent from an awkward landing, unable to fly back down safely. She was frightened but unharmed. The moment she saw us, she called out, and Ashcary rushed forward, wrapping her wings around her daughter with a relief so strong I could feel it from where I stood. The station medical team checked Vess carefully and confirmed that her wing was only strained, not broken. She would need rest, but she would heal completely within a few weeks. Still, the fear of that afternoon stayed with all of us for some time afterward. That night, after Vess had been settled comfortably back in the nursery dome, Ashcary found me sitting quietly outside, watching the artificial stars that lit the station's night sky. "You called her home," she said softly, lowering herself beside me. Even lost and frightened, she knew that sound. She followed it back to safety. "I just did what felt right," I said. "I didn't know if it would work." "That is often how the most important things happen," Ashcary replied. "Not through certainty, but through willingness." We sat together in silence for a while after that, watching the quiet lights above us. I thought about how strange it was that a simple habit from my childhood, something I never once considered special, had now guided a frightened hatchling out of danger not once, but twice. It made me wonder how many small, ordinary things we carry within ourselves without realizing their true value until the moment we need them most. From that day forward, the bond between Vess and me deepened even further, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of the quiet trust built through many small moments, strung together over time. The station staff began referring to the tune, half-jokingly, as the Storm Song, a name that eventually stuck, spoken with real affection rather than mere curiosity. In the months that followed, life at Thren Station continued much as it had before, though quieter, calmer, and filled with a sense of belonging I had not expected to find so far from home. Vess no longer needed constant care, but she still visited me often, sometimes simply to rest nearby while I worked, other times to practice new sounds she was learning to make, sounds that occasionally resembled the tune from long ago. Ashcari and I remained close as well. We often spoke about the future, about what it might mean for humans and Veilithi to build a lasting friendship between their two peoples. She told me once that before the storm, before Ves, she had never truly trusted a human. She admitted that many of her people still held quiet doubts, shaped by old stories and unfamiliar customs. "But you did not ask for my trust," she said. "You simply stayed when it mattered. That is a different thing entirely." I often thought about that conversation in the quiet moments after, especially when I watched Ves grow stronger, braver, and more curious about the wider universe beyond Thren Station. I had come to this place expecting to be a simple bridge between two cultures, someone who translated words and explained customs. I never expected to become part of a story that Veilithi parents might one day tell their own hatchlings, a story about a storm, a song, and a bond that formed not through planning, but through simple presence in a moment that mattered. Looking back now, I understand that what happened between Ves, Ashcari, and myself was not something extraordinary in the way people often imagine great events to be. There was no grand plan, there was no clever strategy. There was only a frightened mother, a newborn dragon, and a nervous habit passed down from my grandmother, arriving at exactly the right moment to offer comfort where none existed. Sometimes, the most important things we bring to a new place are not skills we trained for, or knowledge we studied carefully. Sometimes, they are small, quiet parts of ourselves, carried without thought, offered without expectation, that end up mattering more than we could ever have imagined. Ves still refuses certain foods unless I am nearby, though now it is mostly out of habit, or perhaps simple affection. I do not mind. I still hum the same tune each time, and I suspect I always will, even long after she has grown fully into the powerful, graceful dragon she is clearly meant to become. And every time I hum that old, nameless melody, I think of my grandmother, of storms long past, and of a small dragon who once needed nothing more than a steady voice to remind her that even the worst storms eventually pass, and that safety, once found, is worth holding on to. That, I have come to believe, is the simplest and truest lesson this whole story has to offer, one shared quietly between two very different species, who somehow found a way to understand each other, not through grand speeches or careful diplomacy, but through a single soft sound in the middle of a frightening night. Sometimes late in the evening, when the station lights dim and the artificial stars appear across the dome above the training yard, I see Ves resting near her mother, wings folded, scales calm and steady in color. She is no longer the small, frightened hatchling who once refused every meal unless I sat beside her. She has grown into something stronger, more confident, more sure of her place in this world. Yet even now, when the corridors grow quiet and the station settles into its nightly rhythm, she sometimes lifts her head toward me and lets out a soft, familiar sound, an echo of the tune that once brought her comfort in the middle of a storm. I do not know what the future holds for Thren Station, or for the growing friendship between humans and the Veilithi. I do not know if other bonds like ours will form, or if what happened between Ves, Ashcari, and myself was simply a rare and fortunate accident, born from a single frightening night none of us could have planned. But I know this much for certain. Understanding between two very different peoples does not always begin with careful plans or official meetings. Sometimes it begins with something far smaller, far simpler, and far more human than anyone expects. It begins with staying, when staying is the only thing you can offer. It begins with a steady voice in a dark room. It begins, quite simply, with a song with no name, hummed softly enough for a frightened little dragon to hear.